Thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Gabriella Dawson's heart pounded in rhythm with her horse's desperate gallop. The year was 1875, and she was running not just from the approaching storm, but from a life she could no longer bear, a life that had been decided for her without a single thought to what she might want. Rain began to slash sideways, stinging her face as she urged her exhausted mare forward. The animal was tiring, stumbling on the increasingly muddy trail. Visibility had dropped to mere feet ahead, and Gabriella realized with growing panic that she had lost her way. The rolling hills of Montana Territory stretched in every direction, indistinguishable beneath the curtain of water falling from the sky. "Come on, Penny," she shouted over the storm, leaning forward in the saddle. Just a little farther, but Penny had reached her limit. The mare's next step landed in a hidden hole, and the animal went down with a pained whinny. Gabriella was thrown clear, landing hard on her side in the mud. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, and she let out a cry that was swallowed by the howling wind. Penny had regained her footing but was clearly favoring her right foreleg. Gabriella limped to her horse, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She had nowhere to go, no shelter in sight, and night was falling fast. Taking Penny's reins, she began to lead the injured animal through the storm, hoping against hope that she might stumble upon a homestead or at least some natural shelter. An hour later, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, Gabriella could barely put one foot in front of the other. Her ankle throbbed with every step, and Penny was moving slower by the minute. When lightning illuminated a stand of trees not far ahead, she adjusted her course, thinking at least they might provide some minimal protection from the deluge. She never made it to those trees. Her foot slipped in the mud, and this time when she fell, she couldn't find the strength to rise again. The cold had seeped into her very bones, and a dangerous lethargy was overtaking her. As her eyes began to close, she thought she heard hoofbeats approaching, but surely that was just the thunder playing tricks on her fading consciousness. "Madam? Madam, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from very far away. Rough hands turned her over, and she blinked up into a face obscured by the brim of a dripping hat. "You're in a bad way, madam. Can't leave you out here to die." She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a solid chest that radiated blessed warmth. "The rains just are beginning," the deep voice said as he settled her in front of him on his horse. "You hold on now." Her last conscious thought was that she'd never heard words so strange or so comforting. When Gabriella next opened her eyes, she was in a small, rustic cabin. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and she was wrapped in several blankets on a narrow bed. Her wet clothes had been replaced with an oversized shirt that smelled of pine and horse and man. She tried to sit up, but her head swam alarmingly. "Easy now," said the same deep voice she remembered from the storm. "You've got a fever." A tall figure moved from the shadows into the firelight. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with strong features and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. His dark blonde hair was tied back at the nape of his neck, and a day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely more than a rasp. "Lucas O'Brien." He approached with a cup of something steaming. "Most folks just call me Luke, and you might be." "Gabriella Dawson." She hesitated, then added, "Gabby." He nodded, helping her sit up enough to sip from the cup. The liquid was bitter but warmed her from the inside out. "Willow bark tea," he explained. "For the fever, your ankle's wrapped too, not broken I don't think, but a bad sprain." Memories flooded back her desperate flight, the storm, Penny going down. "My horse," she exclaimed, trying again to rise. Luke gently pressed her back down. "Your mare's fine, bit of a strain, but she's warm and dry in my lean-to. Better off than you were, truth be told." Relief washed over her, followed by embarrassment. "Thank you," she murmured. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need to dwell on what didn't happen," he interrupted. "Rest now. We can talk when you're stronger." Over the next few days, as Gabriella's fever broke and her strength began to return, she learned more about her rescuer. Luke O'Brien had come west from Boston 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of land and freedom. He'd worked as a ranch hand until he'd saved enough to claim his own small parcel. He ran a modest herd of cattle and broke horses on the side, living simply but proudly independent. "What about you?" he asked on the third evening as they shared a surprisingly tasty rabbit stew. "What drives a young woman to ride hell bent through the worst storm we've had all season?" Gabriella stared into her bowl, wondering how much to reveal. Something about Luke's direct gaze made her want to tell him everything. "I was running away," she admitted. "My father. He arranged a marriage for me, to a business associate nearly twice my age." Luke's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "Harold Winters. He owns half the businesses in Helena, including the bank that holds my father's loans." She set her bowl down, appetite gone. "My father lost most of his money in a mining venture gone bad. Marrying me off was his solution." "And you disagreed with this plan," Luke said, a hint of approval in his voice. "I refused outright at first, then I pretended to accept it while planning my escape." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I took what money I had saved and my mother's locket, the only thing of value I own, and fled. I thought I could reach my aunt in Idaho Territory." "Brave," Luke commented, "if not entirely well planned." Gabriella laughed despite herself. "I never claimed it was a good plan. Just the only one I had. And now, once you're healed up, what then?" The question hung between them. In truth, Gabriella hadn't thought beyond escape. Her aunt was her mother's sister, not seen since her mother's funeral 5 years ago. Would she even welcome Gabriella? "And how long before her father's men caught up with her?" "I don't know," she confessed. "But I won't go back, I can't." Luke studied her face in the firelight. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you figure it out. It's not much, but it's dry and safe." "I couldn't impose, it's not imposing if I offer," he said firmly. "Besides, I could use the company. Gets mighty quiet out here with just the cattle and horses for conversation." That night, lying in Luke's bed while he slept on a pallet by the fire, Gabriella stared at the rough-hewn ceiling and wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. She had fled one future only to land in complete uncertainty, yet somehow, she felt safer than she had in months. As days turned into a week and then two, Gabriella's ankle healed enough for her to move around the cabin. She insisted on earning her keep, taking over the cooking and mending Luke's clothes. She discovered she had a talent for bread making, something that delighted Luke beyond all proportion. "Lord Almighty," he said, closing his eyes in bliss as he bit into a warm loaf. "I haven't had proper bread in an age." His appreciation made something warm bloom in her chest. She found herself watching him as he worked around the homestead, the confident way he handled his tools, the gentle firmness he showed his animals, the quiet strength in his hands. For his part, Luke seemed equally fascinated by her. He'd come in from the fields to find her humming as she worked, and he'd pause in the doorway, just watching. When she caught him looking, he'd duck his head and find some task that needed his attention, but not before she spotted the color rising in his cheeks. They developed a routine. Mornings, Luke would see to the livestock while Gabriella prepared breakfast. They'd eat together, talking of small things, the weather, the animals, books they had read. Luke was surprisingly well educated for a rancher, and their conversations ranged far beyond the boundaries of his small homestead. After breakfast, Luke would work his land while Gabriella tended the cabin and garden. In the afternoons, when her ankle permitted, he'd help her to the corral where Penny was recovering, and they'd sit in comfortable silence as Gabriella brushed the mare's coat to a gleaming finish. It was during one such afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, that Luke cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning on the corral fence beside her. "Your ankle's nearly healed. Penny too." Gabriella's heart sank. Was he asking her to leave? "I know you'll be wanting to move on soon," he continued. "But before you do, I thought, maybe you'd like to see more of the country around here. Tomorrow's Sunday, we could ride out, take a picnic." She looked up, surprised to see uncertainty in his usually confident expression. "I'd like that," she said, and was rewarded with a smile that made her pulse quicken. The next day dawned clear and perfect. Luke saddled his gelding and led out a gentle mare for Gabriella, saying Penny could use another day of rest. He'd packed a simple lunch in his saddlebags, and they set out across the rolling grasslands that surrounded his property. Luke was a different man away from the responsibilities of his ranch. He laughed more freely, pointing out wildlife and telling stories of his early days in the territory. Gabriella found herself laughing too, sharing memories of her childhood before her mother's death had cast a shadow over her family. They stopped for lunch on a hillside overlooking a small lake, spreading a blanket on the sweet-smelling grass. As they ate, Luke spoke of his dreams for his ranch, expanding his herd, building a bigger house someday. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Gabriella asked, watching a hawk circle lazily above them. Luke was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Yes," he finally said. "More than I care to admit, especially in winter when the snow piles high and days pass without seeing another soul." "Yet you choose to stay," he nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "This land. It gets in your blood, the freedom of it, the wildness." "I could never go back east, live all hemmed in by other people's expectations." Gabriella understood that feeling all too well. "That's what I was running from," she said softly. "Being hemmed in." Luke turned to look at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "And now?" "Are you still running?" The question caught her off guard. Was she? These weeks at Luke's homestead had been the freest, most content time she could remember. The thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Part of me feels," paused, "like I've stepped outside my life for a moment." Luke reached out, hesitantly covering her hand with his own. His palm was calloused from work but surprisingly gentle. "What if this could be your life?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriella's breath caught. She turned her hand, threading her fingers through his. "What are you asking me, Lucas O'Brien?" "Nothing, everything." He looked down at their joined hands. "Just, don't decide to leave without considering what might be worth staying for." The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that stormy night. Gabriella found herself stealing glances at Luke's profile, wondering what kind of future she might build with this quiet, strong man who had saved her in more ways than one. As they neared the homestead, Luke suddenly reined in his horse, frowning. "What is it?" Gabriella asked, following his gaze. A wagon stood in front of the cabin and two men were moving about the yard. One was checking inside the lean to where the horses were kept. "Visitors," Luke said grimly. "And not the friendly kind from the look of them." Fear lanced through Gabriella's heart. Had her father found her? Or worse, had Harold Winters sent men to bring her back? Luke seemed to read her thoughts. "Stay behind me," he said, urging his horse forward. As they approached, one of the men spotted them and called out to his companion. Both turned to watch them ride in, hands hovering near their holstered guns. "Afternoon," Luke said pleasantly enough, though Gabriella could see the tension in his shoulders. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" "Might be," said the taller of the two, a scar running down one side of his weathered face. "We're looking for a young woman. Runaway. Her father's offering a handsome reward." Luke dismounted casually, then moved to help Gabriella down from her horse, positioning himself between her and the strangers. "That's so. Don't get many runaways out this way. Too much open country, nowhere to hide." The second man, shorter but broader, stepped forward. "This one would have come through about 3 weeks back. Pretty little thing with dark hair. Name of Gabriella Dawson." Gabriella's fingers dug into Luke's arm, but his expression never changed. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." "Last traveler through here was old Jim Kennedy selling pots and pans. That was a month ago at least." The men exchanged looks. "Mind if we look around, just to be sure?" "Actually, I do mind." Luke's voice hardened. "This is private property and I've answered your question." The tall man's hand moved closer to his gun. Now, that's not very neighborly. We've got a job to do, and I've got a shotgun just inside that door, Luke interrupted, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard as flint. Along with every right to use it on trespassers who don't take a polite hint. A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of the wind in the grass. Gabriella held her breath, terrified that violence would erupt at any moment. Finally, the tall man spat in the dust. "Come on, Hank. Waste of time. Girl probably headed for the mining camps." They climbed onto their wagon with poor Grace, the shorter one Hank glaring at Luke as they turned around. "We'll be back if the trail leads this way again," he warned. "I'll have coffee waiting," Luke replied dryly. "And that shotgun." They watched in silence as the wagon disappeared down the rutted trail. Only when it was out of sight did Luke's rigid posture relax. "They'll be back," Gabriella whispered, trembling. "And next time they might bring more men." Luke turned to her, taking her gently by the shoulders. "Then we'll be long gone by then." I'm not letting you face this alone, Gabby." His eyes searched hers. Unless you want to," she shook her head, tears threatening. "No, but I can't ask you to leave your home, everything you've built here." Luke looked around at his small homestead, then back at her. "Home is more than land and buildings. This place, it was starting to feel lonely before you came." His hand moved to cup her cheek. "I'd rather start over somewhere else with you than stay here without you." Heart pounding, Gabriella leaned into his touch. "Are you certain? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you make me laugh. I know the cabin feels empty when you're not in it." He paused, a smile tugging at his lips. "And I know I've fallen in love with you, Gabriella Dawson, storm and all." The admission stole her breath. She reached up, covering his hand with her own. "I think I've fallen in love with you too," she whispered. "Even though it makes no sense, even though it terrifies me." "Love often doesn't make sense," he said, drawing her closer. "But that doesn't make it any less real." Their first kiss was gentle, questioning. The second was not. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "We need to pack," he said reluctantly. "Those men will talk and word travels fast, even out here. We should be gone by morning." They worked through the evening, gathering only what they could carry on horseback. Luke had some money saved, hidden in a tin beneath a floorboard. "Enough," he said, "to get them to California or Oregon, where they could start fresh." As night fell, they sat close by the fire, their plans made, uncertainty and excitement mingling in the air between them. Tomorrow they would leave at first light, traveling west and north, avoiding towns where Gabriella might be recognized. "What about your dream?" Gabriella asked, her head resting on Luke's shoulder. "Your land, your herd. Dreams change," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I can raise cattle anywhere, but you," he tilted her face up to his, "you I can't replace." "I'll make it worth it," she promised. "Wherever we end up, I know you will." His smile was tender in the firelight. "Remember what I told you that night in the rain's just our beginning." "I meant it, though I hardly knew it then." "What did you mean by that?" she asked, having wondered about those strange words since she first heard them. Luke looked thoughtful. "I suppose I meant that even the worst storms pass, and sometimes what comes after is better than what came before." He squeezed her hand. "I never expected the storm to bring me you." They left before dawn, riding double on Luke's sturdy gelding and leading Penny, now recovered enough to travel. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as they topped the ridge that marked the boundary of Luke's land. "Last chance to change your mind," Gabriella said, feeling him take one final look at the homestead below, his arms tightened around her waist. "Nothing to change," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "My mind was made up the moment I found you in that storm." They rode west, into country neither had seen before. The journey was hard, with days of rough travel and nights spent under the stars. They avoided main trails and towns where possible, but necessity occasionally drove them to risk a stop for supplies. In a small settlement near the Idaho border, they found a preacher willing to marry them with minimal questions. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by the preacher's wife and an elderly shopkeeper. Gabriella wore a simple blue dress she'd purchased that morning, and Luke had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future they would build together. That night, in a rented room above the town's only restaurant, they became truly husband and wife. Gabriella had been nervous, but Luke's patience and tenderness banished her fears. In his arms, she found a passion she'd never imagined and a connection that went beyond the physical. "I love you, Mrs. O'Brien," he murmured as they lay tangled together afterward. The name, still new, sent a thrill through her. "And I love you, Mr. O'Brien," she replied, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. They continued west, more cautious now that they were officially fugitives in the eyes of the law. Gabriella for running from her father's authority, and Luke for aiding her. But with each mile, the weight of the past seemed to lighten. They spoke of the future, of the land they would claim, the home they would build, the children they might have. In western Oregon, nearly 2 months after leaving Montana, they found what they were looking for: a fertile valley nestled between gentle hills, with a creek running clear and cold along one edge. The land was available for homesteading, far enough from established towns to offer privacy, but close enough to markets for practicality. They staked their claim and set to work immediately, living in a tent while they built a cabin similar to the one Luke had left behind, but larger, with room to grow. By winter, they had walls and a roof, a small herd of cattle purchased with Luke's savings, and a garden plot cleared for spring planting. Their first Christmas was celebrated with simple gifts: a new hat Gabriella had saved for and purchased in secret for Luke, and for her, a delicate silver locket to replace the one she'd sold along the way to fund their journey. "Open it," Luke urged as she turned the locket over in her hands. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper, folded impossibly small. Gabriella carefully unfolded it to find a message in Luke's neat handwriting. "The rain was just our beginning, the best is yet to come." Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him. "It's perfect," she whispered. "There's more," he said, a nervous excitement in his voice. He handed her a small wooden box. Inside lay a deed official and stamped with the territorial seal. "Luke, what is this?" "Our land, officially registered to Mr. and Mrs. Lucas O'Brien." He took her hands in his. "No one can take it from us now. It's ours, free and clear." The significance wasn't lost on her. Without a legal claim, they had been vulnerable to her father's influence, to anyone who might recognize them and report their whereabouts. But with this document, they had legitimacy. Protection. How? She asked. They had been so careful with their money, every penny accounted for. "I sold my pocket watch," he admitted. "The silver one that was my father's. Got a good price for it in town last week." The sacrifice humbled her. That watch was one of the few connections Luke had to his past, his family back east. "Oh, Luke, don't fret over it," he said, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "It was just a thing. This," he tapped the deed, "this is our future." Spring brought new life to their valley calves in the pasture, seedlings in the garden, and the news that Gabriella was expecting their first child. Luke's joy at the announcement was boundless. He spun her around their cabin, then set her down gently, suddenly concerned for her delicate condition. "Are you all right? I shouldn't have." She silenced him with a kiss. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she laughed, "and happier than I've ever been." As her body changed with the growing life inside her, Gabriella often thought of that stormy night that had changed the course of her life. How close she had come to freezing to death, alone in the Montana wilderness. How different everything might have been if Luke hadn't found her. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, she shared these thoughts with him. "You ever wonder what might have happened if our paths hadn't crossed that night?" she asked, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child grew. Luke considered the question, his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think maybe they were always meant to cross." Maybe all the choices we made, all the turns we took, were leading us to that storm, to each other. That's a lovely thought, she said, leaning into his embrace. That we were destined to find each other. Whether it was destiny or chance, Luke said, his voice warm with emotion, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Gabby O'Brien. Their daughter was born as autumn painted the valley in russet and gold. They named her Lillian Rose Lily for short, a beautiful, strong name for a child born of love and courage. Luke wept when he first held her, this tiny miracle with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. She's perfect, he whispered, awestruck, just like her mother. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. Their herd expanded, their garden flourished, and their reputation in the scattered community grew as hardworking, honest folks who kept to themselves but were always ready to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. On rare occasions, news from the East would filter through carried by travelers or reported in month-old newspapers. 2 years after their arrival in Oregon, such a paper brought word that Harold Winters had died, leaving his considerable fortune to charity after a brief, unhappy marriage to a woman from San Francisco. Gabriella's father had lost his business entirely and moved back east to live with relatives. "Are you sad?" Luke asked as she set the paper aside. "About your father, I mean." Gabriella considered the question, bouncing Lily on her knee. "Not sad exactly. I wish things had been different between us, but I made my choice and it was the right one." She smiled at her husband. "I have no regrets." As the years passed, their family grew. Lily was joined by a brother, Samuel, and later by twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth. The cabin expanded too, with new rooms added as needed. They built a proper barn, dug a well closer to the house, planted an orchard. On the 10th anniversary of the night Luke had found Gabriella in the storm, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Lily, now 9, was teaching 7-year-old Samuel how to lasso a fence post, while the 5-year-old twins collected wildflowers by the creek. "Did you ever imagine this?" Gabriella asked, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "That night in the rain, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Luke smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening evidence of a decade of laughter and sun. "Not in the specifics," he admitted. "But I knew somehow that you were going to change my life." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You know what I thought when I first saw you lying there in the mud?" She shook her head. Even after all these years, he could still surprise her. "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. To ride out in that storm, all alone, running towards something instead of just away." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been on their wedding night. "I fell a little in love with you right then, before you even opened your eyes." "And now?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Now I fall in love with you a little more each day." He kissed her softly, a kiss that held the memory of all they had been through together and the promise of all that was still to come. "The rain really was just our beginning, Gabby." She smiled against his lips. "And what a beautiful journey it's been." Around them, their land stretched green and vibrant, the home they had built together strong and welcoming. Their children's laughter rose on the evening breeze, a testament to the love that had begun in a desperate flight through a Montana storm and flourished against all odds in this peaceful Oregon valley. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in the same colors that had welcomed them to this land so many years ago. Gabriella and Luke stood together, watching as day gave way to dusk, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together just as they had from the very beginning.